In today's episode, Jody Smith discusses his experience with anxiety and epilepsy that eventually led to the surgical removal of his amygdala in his brain. He recounts his post-surgery recovery and the ensuing changes he noticed in his personality and behavior, in particular with the absence of fear. He's been featured on many platforms before because of how unique his story is, and now even advocates the surgery for individuals with any form of crippling anxiety. I'm so excited to have you here with me, Jody. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat.
So, Jody, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you in the world right now?
Yeah, I'm in New York City, and a little bit about myself. I'm Jody. I'm 33, a software developer. I always go through the basics.
What was your childhood like? Were you close to your parents? Were you close? Do you have siblings? What was that like?
Ooh, that's a loaded question because there's so much to go over. Do you have 30 minutes? But I mean, I guess short answer is, parents split when I was young, and then a couple years later, my dad passed away. I was pretty badly bullied in school until I became 6 feet tall. And then I guess, my brother also passed away, and I guess still technically the end of my childhood era. I've always been an optimistic person, so it's hard to say that I came out all that, traumatized in any way from any of that.
Your story gets really, really fascinating as you sort of age because, you had, a series of physical health problems that led to a very big surgery. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about what was going on in terms of your health?
Yeah. So for my entire life, generally grew up healthy, and I was going back to college for a second go around age 24 and was experimenting with caffeine for the first time. And I was getting a little bit too much into caffeine at one point. I was having 1 or 2 5-hour energies a day and having these mild panic attacks that were or things that I would describe at the time as mild panic attacks, feeling of something's wrong. Oh yeah, something is wrong, but no context for what's wrong, just the general sensation. And I was like, oh, I'm having 2 5-hour energies on Fridays in order to go to school and go work Uber late into the night. So I was up for 21 hours. Maybe that causes a panic attack. That felt logical to me. So I didn't think about it for 6 months until come a very quiet and chill party with my grandma. I started to feel like, oh man, something's really wrong. And I was like, man, this panic attack's way more intense. I should probably go take a walk, get some air. And I remember getting up and starting to walk down my grandma's driveway. And the other 20 minutes, I only have eyewitness testimony to describe.
And would you say this was the first of many, or was this the first that caused you to go and seek out proper medical health check?
So yeah, ambulance shows up. I'm only mildly responsive. By the time my memory kicks in, I was struggling to remember my age, but it was near my birthday, so I guess it wasn't crazy. They thought, oh, is he having a stroke? Was it a seizure? I didn't have any evidence of having any convulsions, and nobody saw that for about 20 minutes. I wasn't really me. I was moving a little bit. I was responding to people talking. And so they're like, you should probably get checked out to see if this is epilepsy. And then I went, within the next week, went under an EEG machine. And while talking to them, they're like, hey, all those little panic attacks you've been having, those were probably seizures. And I was like, what? No, I feel uneasy for 30 seconds. No, a seizure is when you fall down and you start shaking. I didn't do any of that. Don't worry about it. They're like, no, those were seizures. And so then under EEG, they were like, all right, we're going to need 3 days. And within 4 hours of the first EEG, I was able to trigger a seizure for them. My go-to was playing loud music and lots of caffeine. Loud percussive music that would trigger my seizures. And at the time, I didn't know they were seizures, but then they saw on EEG that my right temporal lobe was spiking and weaving and saying, yeah, no, that's a seizure, and we got to start you on medication.
That's so interesting. I mean, like, you were having these like mild panic attacks for a while as well, but because it didn't manifest into something so physical, it was hard to tell. And from what I know, what a seizure is or an epilepsy is something that's very, very physical. So a seizure is basically something that just shows in the brain, that it doesn't have to be something that's so physical. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah. Actually, so there's two interesting things. One is I spoke to a couple of psychiatrists and like people who are very familiar with just generally recommending people to get diagnosed with epilepsy based on certain symptoms. They're like, oh no, because sometimes people experience panic attacks and then they'll sort of zone out for a second and they won't think it's a seizure. And as soon as a psychiatrist hears, they're zoning out, that's probably, we need to check that out because that might be a seizure. Because that moment of zoning out, it's called an absence seizure. But it's very rare for someone to present with such mild seizures that the psychiatrist that I spoke to said, if you didn't have that big one, I wouldn't have even recommended you to a EEG because that really does just sound like a panic attack. But they do present very similarly. They're just similar activity in the brain.
So interestingly, you mentioned that you were able to trigger a seizure really fast. So you had basically figured out what were your triggers really early on. Would you say that that was, in a way, a luck stroke? You were lucky to have figured it out early? Or how much of a difference would it have made if you'd found out earlier or later?
I was having 3 a day in general, as I came to find out that like I was able to trigger 3 a day. So me knowing my triggers was more just a matter of me constantly being curious about what's going on and paying attention and remembering that for those 6 months in the morning, as soon as a percussive song came on, that weird panic attack could start. Literally while I'm driving to work, listening to the ting-tings, and I'm like, oh wow, that makes me feel like something's wrong, even though I know that nothing's wrong. That's interesting. So I was like, hey, let me try crazy Skrillex or something like that. And hey, what do you know? It worked. Skrillex and caffeine pills. But it's, I don't think it significantly changed that particular experience. It was more effective leading up to brain surgery. It was more important that I knew my triggers then because it was a much narrower window that we had to work with. And it was a lot harder to trigger seizures then.
And you mentioned that every time that you were having a seizure, it was somewhat damaging your brain further. And this is why you decided to go ahead with the surgery. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, I actually, after just those 6 months of mild seizures and that one big one, they were able to see 8% atrophy in the right hippocampus, which is a really delicate part of the brain, which means the seizures were happening right near it. And that part of the brain is important, handles a lot of memory function. And I was experiencing severe drop-off in memory function and speech from the pre-big seizure to post-big seizure. But even before the beginning of that phenomena, over the course of those 6 months, I was like, well, how am I forgetting these things? What's wrong with me? I have no idea. I forgot a midterm and just cut a class that I was like, oh, I'm too good at this class. I don't need to go to this lecture. Oh, that was the midterm. Oh, I never forget that. What's wrong with me?
So again, like this leads me back to sort of what I had asked earlier. Like if you hadn't noticed it or gotten that big attack and then gone to the doctor for that checkup at that time, and say if that got delayed or dragged on for a year, 2 years, how much damage then would that have caused?
It's hard to say without the big seizure. I actually asked that, is like, how much do we think of they're like, this is a lot of damage for one seizure to cause, but it's also a lot of damage for just tiny seizures to cause. They think there was a chance that I'd been having tiny little seizures since I was, 13, but they couldn't know for sure. But it's hard to say how it would have progressed without medication, because once I started on medication, I never had another big seizure. It's very possible that if I didn't start medication, I would have had another big seizure. People die just from having seizures at a rate of 1 in 1,000 per year of people diagnosed with epilepsy.
Wow. You really missed the mark, I guess, in a way. Well, I don't know if that's the right way of saying this, but yeah.
I was really going for that 1 in 1,000 chance of dying, but I messed it up.
No. Okay, so my next question to you is, when you decided to go with the surgery at that point, were you presented with other options, or was it, this is the only way that you can fix this problem?
So one of the things that I've come to learn is important while working with other people who are experiencing epilepsy, I realized that the whole time that I was getting this medication treatment, we were trying different medications, seeing what I could tolerate. I was in school to be a software developer. I was writing my own little note-taking program to track my seizures and put it into like an Excel sheet for a graph. And it was like, oh, hey guys. So I noticed that when we raised the dose of this, my seizures went from 2.75 per day to 1.86 per day. Is that? And they're like, okay, that doesn't help at all. We're looking for zero, but like, cool.
Thank you.
Nice. Yay. I'm glad you're experiencing fewer seizures. That's better than, more, but we're going for zero. So they came to me with a very like data-oriented approach, saying research that we know, once someone has failed five different medications, and failed means you tried them, you went to a dose that should be effective, and you didn't reach zero seizures, that the chance of any medication ever working is extremely low. And we know from the EEG that the seizure focus is pretty clear and in a spot that is operable. It was in my right temporal lobe, and knowing the way the brain works, it's a part of the brain that if they had to operate on it, it's one of the ones that I think that people would choose. If they had to choose one, that would be the non-dominant temporal lobe is kind of the least important of of all.
How so? Why so?
Well, I mean, the frontal lobe is kind of what makes us humans. I would have personality changes. I would have all sorts of problems. Dominant temporal lobe is where speech happens. I'd have, really difficult time learning to talk again. And back in the occipital lobe is vision. And right temporal lobe is like spatial memory. So like, imagine trying to like trace your steps after you've done something. If you're just 50% worse than that, is your life terrible? And like, you can like, I was going to get better at it over time, but like, it's not the end of the world. And if it takes you a little bit longer to recognize someone's face, it's not like, oh no, I'm disabled.
Yeah. I guess we also live in a world where, you can access a map on your phone anytime. So it's just like, follow the map,
That's literally what they said. They're like, in today's world, you really don't need it. Maybe when like we were just navigating with like trees and no landmarks, it would have been important. But now, as long as I can follow landmarks or a map, it's not really a big deal. And it's also, I'm not terrible at that. I'm just worse than I was.
Interesting. So walk me through the moment when you sat with the doctor and they were explaining this surgery to you. What is going to happen? What are they going to remove? How is that going to affect you? How did you feel?
Well, it was a bit of a process. The first thing that happened is the doctor that I had in Ohio said, hey, you're going to get surgery, and I know you're going back to New York, and here's the place that I would recommend. So I went to New York, and they were like, oh, well, let's do some more tests. They did a bunch of tests, and they actually found something at the base of my skull, right at the right temporal lobe where the seizures were happening. On the fourth MRI that I got in total, they found something called an encephalocele, which is a little bit of my brain grew through my skull. It was like a dime-sized amount of brain was poking out of my skull. And they're like, we don't really know if that was causing it, but hey, the seizures are coming from that area, so probably. So we'll cut that out too when we're in there. But they also described two options. One is there was what's called a standard resection. They're able to kind of listen to my brain waves through my skull with an EEG, but they described it as kind of putting your ear up against the door to listen to a conversation happening in another room. You can't hear very well. So the option was go in with the information we have now, one brain surgery, get it over with, and 1% chance of complications. The other suggestion was we could get a better picture if we cut open your brain, inserted 36 probes, had you have seizures again with the probes inside your brain, and then do another seizure to remove the part that we now understand the seizures are coming from.
Yeah, interesting. So you would have to be awake for that to trigger the seizure? How would that work?
It sounds a little bit crazier than it was for me because I woke up and I had a helmet on and I was conscious and not under anesthetic for like 6 days. So I would sleep, but I had wires that were going deep into my brain coming out of this little helmet and a little a little sack of cerebral spinal fluid for the stuff that was leaking out that they like siphoned into a little ball. It's funny because that Mad Max Fury Road had just come out and it was my little blood bag. So I was like, oh, witness me, blood bag.
Yeah.
And then they were like, all right, first we want you to do seizures. So do that thing that you're so good at doing, which is harder right after you come out of surgery because all those medications don't immediately leave your system and they suppress your brain a little bit. So it was a few days before I even had a seizure and they had taken me off of my medication. It was like really weird that I wasn't having seizures. What's funny is they actually also asked if I wanted to volunteer for some studies they were doing on like the inner workings of the brain. So they had like people come in and ask me questions or like try to accomplish tests so that they could see now with probes inside someone's brain what parts of the brain activate when trying to do certain activities. They were really exciting. For me, I was like, oh, wow, that's really interesting that I can like provide information on what different brain locations activate during specific tasks.
That's so cool.
But then in order to actually trigger the seizure, I was like probably 4 days in, still hadn't had a seizure. I had been having a lot of caffeine, sleep deprived for like 26 hours or more. And they were like, all right, we know you said that alcohol sometimes triggers it, so we're going to prescribe you a beer. And they prescribed me a beer, and it worked. I had a seizure that within a couple hours of that beer. They were like, all right, we're ready to go. We have a beautiful map of where the seizure came from. We're going to cut that part out, and we give you a 90% chance of success in terms of being seizure-free.
So the first option that they presented to you would have been done externally, so they wouldn't actually open up and do the surgery. Would it be like a laser treatment? Like how was that going to happen?
Oh, no. The first one, the detection part was external, but they still would have gone in. They just would have gone in with the information they had from the outside. So they would have cut out a part that they were like, okay, the front half of the right temporal, basically a very similar amount of brain that they ended up taking out. But with the 2-stage surgery, they could see if they needed to take out maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, so because while they were pretty confident that all the seizures were coming from the front half of my right temporal lobe, what if it was just the front 2/5? Or what if it was the front 3/5? So they wanted to make sure they got that level of precision when deciding to cut out my brain. Sometimes that's important.
Fair enough. How long was the recovery then? And what was recovery like for you?
Well, there was a couple of interesting parts. One is after each brain surgery, I was given a drug called Decadron. I think the generic is dexamethasone, which they were also giving to COVID patients. It made me, I guess, some people described a little manic. I remember like day 2 after brain surgery, I was like, I'm ready to go. Let's go home. And they're like, no, we're like, we still need to observe you. I was like, but I feel great. What? They're like, yeah, but like your brain is like, there's still things could go wrong. I was like, oh yeah, I guess I don't want my brain to explode. I do remember one little thing that I guess I'm a little happy to say. I remember waking up from the second brain surgery and my mom's there and I was like, oh, hey mom, tell everyone I'm okay. That's the first thing I say coming out of brain surgery. And the surgeon had told me to expect like the worst headache of my life, but it wasn't all that bad. Most of the pain was because they had to cut through my temporal muscle that controls my jaw. So the weirdest thing is that smiling made the pain go away because it relaxed that. So I just had to like sit there like
the irony,
with a little grin on my face for like it took maybe like an hour or two for the severe part of that pain to go away.
Right.
But there's all sorts of quirks that happen in the first stages of that recovery because they had just like injured my brain in such a severe way. The first couple hours I would have these artifacts, basically little black dots that would show up and I would interpret movement in things that would logically move despite my conscious mind knowing that they didn't move. So imagine a curtain. Part of me would say that curtain moved, but I know that it didn't. It couldn't have. It's very still. I'm looking at it and it didn't move, but part of like my brain was just going, that moved. The recovery road was all sorts of speed bumps after that we can go into, but it'll be a long story. But generally, I would say physical recovery was very quick. There were about 4 or 5 weeks of severe introversion is what I'd call it. Being in a conversation for more than a couple minutes, I'd just be like, wow, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to need to go rest. But I had family like help with, general housework and stuff. And there were attention issues that persisted and got interfered with work for about 6 months and still persist to this day to a degree. And I mean, geez, we can keep going. There's a lot more. Because I guess the question is when did recovery end? There's the acute recovery of I went within a month and a half, I went on a date. I was well enough that I thought I could go on a date.
Yeah.
But I didn't go back to work in full for 6 months.
So in a sense, it's more like maybe recovery in the sense, at what point did you come to terms with it and just accept it and realize that this is the new you and you're one with it? Like letting it form your new identity in a sense.
That was an interesting one because I didn't accept anything as the new me at the time because I was still on epilepsy medication. And as anyone will tell you, those are really severe medications. I would describe them as almost like training weights on your brain. They're meant to slow your brain down. A seizure is your brain going too fast, uncontrollably. So the only thing we found to be effective in terms of medication is literally stuff that slows down the gates that open to allow your neurons to communicate. So opening really fast is important for certain things like balance and memory. And those were all negatively impacted by those medications. So even though I had had the brain surgery, I still needed to take epilepsy medication for the foreseeable future. So I was like, I'm actually delineated myself into versions. Like Jody 1.0 was the person before I had seizures. Then 2.0 is Jody with seizures before surgery. 3.0 after surgery, still on medication. And you're talking to 4.0, which is no medication after surgery.
Interesting. So interesting. Tell me a little bit about what are the significant changes that occurred after the surgery? Like the part that was removed, how did you notice those changes? What did you do to test those changes out per se?
I mean, the one that everyone around me noticed from the beginning and is the talkativeness. It was out of control. The way I described it to my doctor was like, when someone else is talking, I feel like I have to talk in the way I feel like I have to pee when I have to pee really bad. It's just like, oh, I'm gonna talk. I want to talk. But this person is talking and I don't want to be rude, but I really want to talk. And my partner at the time was long-term diagnosed with ADD. And she was like, wow, this is like super ADD. This is like me off meds when I was 12. Like, whoa. And the talkativeness, which you're going to experience on this conversation, is the most severe. Leading up to the brain surgery, I had done some research because the doctors were cagey with certain amounts of information. They didn't tell me about, for example, that statistic I told you, 1 in 1,000 people with epilepsy die every year. They didn't tell me that. I found that out separately and I confirmed it with them. I was like, hey, this is a thing. They're like, oh, yeah, that's a thing. If you tell someone with epilepsy that they might die, they're just going to be anxious and have more seizures. And then that increases the chance of dying. And there's nothing they can do about it other than take the pills. So just don't bother. Don't tell them. And I was like, okay, what else? What is this part of my brain that they're taking out of me? And because when I said, what's going to happen? And they're like, well, you might lose a tiny fraction of your upper left field of view, spatial memory, facial recognition, intonation, and rhythm is all right temporal lobe. And then right amygdala does things like anxiety and harm avoidance. And right after brain surgery, I remember having a 2-hour woe is me session of just but even, I'm going through all this, but I'm going to die anyway. What was the point of this? This is on manic drugs. That was the day after I came home from the hospital. But at some point I was like, but does it matter if I die? And that was a moment of wait a second, who am I? I always cared about dying. I always thought it mattered if I die. And then that was a moment where I was like, hey, wait a second, that whole fear thing. I spoke to my doctor about it. I was like, my relationship with my fear of death has changed significantly. I feel significantly less afraid of it. He's like, yeah, that makes sense. We cut out your right amygdala. So
Oh, just FYI.
they had told me they were cutting out that part. But no, yeah, that's true. They never were like, by the way, you might have like less anxiety or anything. Never suggested that would be a thing. They always just said, you'll be fine. You're a smart guy. You'll be fine.
Fair enough. And do you feel like that was one of the most impactful things for you?
It was certainly the most shocking. I think the average person of my, I guess, socioeconomic status, we'll call it, or whatever, doesn't experience life-threatening fear very often. If anything, you know, I was already pretty chill about that going into the brain surgery, despite like generally having a chronically hyperbolic fear of death throughout my entire life, which a lot of people will go, oh yeah, your brother died. Of course you'd be scared of your inevitable death. But like, I was taking risks though. I was, you know, I would rock climb, I would go fly experimental airplanes, I would skydive, whatever. I wasn't a fearful person. So like, it was hard to find out that there was anything different. So it did lead me to do experiments. Like the first experiment I did, all right, let's go into a dark forest and you guide me. And then I'm going to try to find my way back and not using any landmarks and just feel my way back. But then, of course, with fear, it's a lot easier to experiment with that one because just hike, which I was doing anyway, and then walk up to a cliff and see what happens. And like, very conscious of the idea that I didn't want to fall and thinking, wow, people would think I'm really freaking stupid if I just fell experimenting about my fear of fall, like death. There wasn't that overwhelming back the fuck up right now that the brain provides, that there's no like will to fight that instinct. When you have that instinct, it just happens. And that wasn't there. There was the conscious, I don't want to get hurt.
No, it's really interesting though that you say that because like, you know, I really do sit down and think about myself and it's so hard to disconnect the two, the rational side versus the fear side, because they just go so hand in hand. Like when I'm standing at the edge of the cliff, rationally, I know that it's obviously not a smart idea to step forward, but also there is the physiological response, like the sweating, the heart palpitation, you know, that stuff. And so when you say you do not feel that inevitable fear of dying, is it you mean more the physical responses?
I think that's part of it, how I knew it was different. But there's also a mental component and emotional component because there was another situation where I was walking through a neighborhood that I would describe as rough in Newark. This lady across the street waves to 5 guys, goes, there, at me and my friend. And I don't tense up. I consciously knew the right thing to do was just keep walking. Previously, my mind would have started racing in a way that I was sort of just, this is going to happen, as opposed to like, all right, this is going to happen. But if that guy does this and this guy does that, I'm going to, it was just like, all right, yeah, okay. And it wasn't out of any sort of depression. I didn't want my phone to get stolen. I was like focused on the mission of act like they don't bother me. They did bother me. I didn't want it, but act like they don't. I wasn't feeling like, holy shit, this is happening, you know?
Yeah. Let me ask you, like, I know that the brain has a lot to do with hormones. So what about adrenaline then? Do you feel the adrenaline rush in situations?
So that was actually one thing that I didn't really think about until I made the post that started all this attention on Reddit when someone was like, asked me that question. I was like, there were still plenty of times where I felt adrenaline. I remember that like going on a first date, I was like, there was all sort of anxious, I hope she likes me. There was adrenaline and, you know, all the exciting things that happen in romance or triggered adrenaline. I think the one thing that's hard for me to say is whether it's performing exactly the same way it did before, because life has just been not the same. I mean, as I said, I was flying experimental airplanes. I went and flew a plane about a month after brain surgery, and with a professional pilot, you know, I didn't fly alone, and I felt not super thrilled about it, but I don't think I would have felt super thrilled about it if I didn't have the brain surgery. I was just like, oh, I don't really like this particular plane, but it's nice to be able to know I can still fly. I still have I was just checking that I had the mechanical ability and mental ability to still fly. So adrenaline still happens though. I certainly still feel lots of, I guess, other forms of excitement.
Interesting. So it's just like not the adrenaline kick when you're in a life-threatening situation per se, but you feel it when it's, I don't know, something else like a date.
Yeah, and it would be something that I think the average person would probably use the word fear for that feeling. And the reason that's one of the reasons I have to sort of separate out different feelings of aversion. And I was only able to do that because I was feeling this particular brand of fear whenever I had a seizure. I separate them out into brands because there's very distinct feelings. The feeling that someone gets when they're leaning over a cliff and they go, whoa, and they pull back. It's a distinct feeling from, I don't know if this girl's going to like me. They both are kind of in the same genre, but they're not the exact same feeling. And there would be some components of each that you feel when those two situations happen. But there are distinct feelings that you can literally take out of someone's brain. So all the other aversion. I like to explain this with an analogy around pain, is that if you just woke up tomorrow and you don't feel any pain, and then someone's like, all right, take this knife, and if you want, do whatever you want, then you're like, oh, okay. You don't just cut off your arm because you know it wouldn't hurt. You're like, I want to use that arm later. I don't care that it's not going to hurt. There are other reasons that I've determined to not cut off my arm. I no longer have the instinct reaction of, ow, that hurts. But I still know not to touch really hot things. To use that analogy, I can feel the heat, but it doesn't hurt.
Yeah, no. That's really interesting. Do you feel like now that part of you has been removed, how has it changed your perspective on things, on life? Do you feel better, happier? Do you feel emotionally? How does it make you feel?
I mean, it was truly revolutionary. The first moment that the same logical answers for why not to be afraid of one's inevitable mortality, the logical, a-religious answers, just the answer that ended up for me was if there's no difference between me and a rock, then when I die, I don't change. And if there is a difference between me and a rock, then there's something special that's maybe some sort of spirit something. And who cares if my physical body dies then? Because I'm a spirit. I may not have the answer to whether I'm a spirit or a rock, but either way, when I die, it doesn't change. Whoa, that answer did not work for me 2 days ago before I cut out that part of my brain. Yeah. So this is amazing. And it was this revolutionary moment of oh, okay, so that part of me, that hyperbolic fear of death that I always described as part of what makes Jody Jody is gone. I felt empowered and liberated, and it's such an incredible lesson that I like to share with other people. You don't have to go through brain surgery to experience transformation. That's just the idea that such a thing could happen, and such a thing that I described as such a part of me wasn't necessarily a part of me. It was just a malfunctioning part of my body.
What about your relationship with free will? When that part of your brain was removed, you realized that there was a part of your personality, your identity that had changed that you didn't really have much control over. In fact, you lost it without choosing to, in a sense. So what is your thoughts on free will then?
Well, that's actually, I think, the thing that I want to get on a soapbox about whenever I talk about this is just I'm instantly I didn't think I had the ability to cure this part of me. I thought it was who I am. I was identifying with this anxiety. It's Jody, the human that is Jody, includes super duper duper smart and funny and totally scared of my inevitable death. Part of the picture of what made me me, that was one of them. It was as much a part of me as any other like or dislike I had. If I liked donuts and I was terrified of death, those are things. And if you cut out someone's part of their brain and they just suddenly, they go from liking dogs to not liking dogs, that would be okay, well, wait, I thought But the exciting thing for me is that made me realize that I was sick. I had a mental health problem that had a very physical manifestation in my brain. And people were treating me so much differently afterwards because they're like, oh, well, you had brain surgery, so now we believe you when you have these problems. Not like they weren't not necessarily not believing me before, but I certainly wasn't believing other people's mental health issues necessarily. Like, oh, well, they're just, oh, they're depressed, but they just need to go outside. Like, have they tried not being sad? But I think the revelation is we've come to identify with our mental health issues in a way that we don't identify with our other health issues. The way that someone with Crohn's disease, they have horrible intestinal pain, but they're not just like, that's who I am. I'm an intestinal pain kind of person. That's part of what makes me me. They have chronic intestinal pain, but they don't say that's part of their personality. But if someone has something going wrong with their brain that gives them hyperbolic anxiety, even if it's not epilepsy, they still often identify with that. They say, I'm an anxious person. I'm just uncontrollably anxious. That's who I am. And that was that moment of just, wait a second. No, that's not who we are. If we're experiencing this hyperbolic sensation that is interfering with our life, there's a mechanical reason for that. It's coming from a part of our brain, this primitive part of our brain, the, reptilian part of our brain that can be treated. I'm curious, though, how much you could apply to a person who just is in a wheelchair bound for the rest of their life. Suddenly the world is seen differently based on their physical capabilities. And that's actually something that I would make analogies for as my brain function was decreasing as I was continuing to have seizures and take medication. I was thinking slower. I was performing worse in school. All sorts of things were going wrong. My speech was falling apart. And I would say I felt like a person trapped inside a broken brain in the way a paraplegic feels like a person trapped inside a broken body. It would absolutely. And that was the hard part of determining my identity as who am I now that I'm different, because I identified with the person that I had been for 26 years. And now I am different. I'm like other things that have changed. I'm more empathetic in all sorts of ways. We grow. But it's like the way I think we should think about it for me and is not too different from the experience people have as they age. If you had a conversation with your 10-year-old self, there are very different things very different brain functions that you have. And it's who you are and what your choices were that led you from A to Z is really not something that I can answer. But my transformation happened overnight to a degree, but it is still very similar to the transformation that we have over 10 years, or even 40 years. Like when you're 75, you're not going to be as sharp and energetic as you are now, but are you still you? But yeah, right? But I just experienced that overnight. I experienced things like aging overnight. But I do want to just lend some support to what you were saying before, because I was struggling with that concept of like, if this brain surgery never happened, would I have still made these decisions? I can't know how much I've changed since, in the past 5 years since brain surgery, how much of that is related to literally missing 10% of my brain or just growing up and having an experience. The partner that I was with when I was diagnosed with, she cheated on me while I was in the hospital, and there's all sorts of abuse things that happened over the time, and I started distrusting people and then learned to trust people. All that happened. I don't think that those things would have been very different if I just had heart surgery, but they still impacted who I am today. So it's really hard to parse, because I think one of the things that, I was describing, I come out of brain surgery and I don't immediately know everything that's different. I still can't say for certain everything that has changed down to the minute detail. I recognize faces, I think, as well as I did before brain surgery, but what if I'm a quarter second off? Maybe I don't even realize, because it's been 5 years since I could recognize faces a quarter second faster than I do now. But is that changing my experience of the world? No.
Yeah, that's a fair point. That's a good way to see it as well. Would you recommend this procedure for other people that have Tell me.
Absolutely. I think that's the joke I always make. And actually, one important thing, sorry to cut you off. I volunteered for advocacy because a lot of people are scared of brain surgery in a way that I wasn't. I coped with my anxiety by researching and all, and I was like, okay, brain surgery is the right choice. I agree with my doctors from my independent research. Not to sound like an anti-vaxxer, I did my own research, but I did. But the doctors agreed with my research. So that's, I made that decision pretty confidently. But there are a lot of people out there who are like, brain surgery is scary. I don't want to do that. And they're done. They're like, they don't think about it after that. It's scary. I don't want to do it. And the doctors have been like, hey, Jody, you're kind of like the poster boy of success. Can you go talk to these people and like talk to them about brain surgery, what your experience was like? Because a lot of people who go into brain surgery are a lot less cognitively capable than I was when they were having severe speech problems going into brain surgery. So coming out of brain surgery, they still have speech problems. And you go talk to someone who can barely talk, they might not be thrilled about getting brain surgery. But if I didn't tell you, you wouldn't know. I would just come off like an enthusiastic person. So I actually literally recommend this brain surgery to other people that are going, but I often joke when people ask me, like, was it worth it? I was like, yeah, I highly recommend it for, like, anyone. Cut out your right amygdala. It's not useful for the modern human. Like, although I have considered in the past whether anxiety is the reason we do things, but that's a whole other conversation. Like I guess, but just to quickly go over that concept, explain that. If I didn't have anxiety, would I remember to do my homework when I'm 13? Would I be worried about getting bad grades? Probably not. I would need some anxiety to handle my immaturity and go, oh, bad thing's going to happen if I do this. So I think a little 13-year-old me needed some anxiety to go, oh, if I don't do my homework, I'm going to get a bad grade. And that feels bad about that. Anxiety is now motivating me to do something unpleasant.
Yeah. The term anxiety, though, is often like linked with mental health, right? So, I would say like anxiety is almost a sort of extremer form of stress.
Yeah.
And stress is what I would say is healthy for people to have, because it's stress also that leads people to act and to avoid certain situations or to look forward and be like, okay, if I don't do this. But once it taps into anxiety, I wonder whether anxiety is really the healthy or a healthy response to things.
Yeah. And I still feel stress. Like there was still plenty of other stressing feelings that I was getting, and that has not changed. Like I said, is this girl gonna like me? Am I gonna do this right? Did I just hurt that person's feelings? Like there were all sorts of those stressors that are still there. So I think because they are so hard to parse, I wonder how much that plays a role in our learning growing up. So I think having it happen as an adult, good, but like I don't think children running around without amygdala, I wouldn't. No, they need that. So many people actually have been like, I struggle with constant anxiety. I wish I could get this surgery. People have done ablative surgery to the right amygdala for PTSD, and it has been effective. So it is something that I think there is research into. Like, people don't need that shit. Take that shit out. It's like the appendix. You're not going to take it out of a healthy person. But once it's bad, get that shit out of here.
Get it out. Yeah. No, that's really, really interesting. For our listeners that are listening, you have options. Just to know there are options that can be really effective. So, okay. So my last question to you to wrap up this interview today is, what are some reflections that you've taken away from this experience and anything that you have to impart to our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I already went over the part of just encouraging people to consider their mental health issues as separate from their personality, separate from their identity, and to recognize that health issues are health issues. But I also want to qualify that with the idea that doesn't free you from the responsibility of taking care of yourself. If you've got Crohn's disease and you're just like, well, it's not my fault that I've got Crohn's disease, so I'm just going to lay here and have Crohn's disease and just die. Like, no, you have to go seek treatment for your health issues, mental health issues, or, from the neck down. Well, no matter what part of your brain is ailing, seek treatment. But don't identify with it as like, I am just an anxious person, there's nothing I can do about it. There are less invasive solutions to it, but there are solutions to it. And I think one of the things that I recognized that I forgot to bring up before is that I don't know if you ever had the experience, I'm sure you have, of just having a cold and you almost forget what it feels like to breathe normally. And she's like, what does it even feel like to not be congested? Oh my God. And one of the things that brain surgery gave me that moment was like, this is what it feels like to not feel anxious. Here's this breath of fresh air. Here's what normal feels like. And I knew what to target. And when I no longer felt normal, I was like, so then something's bothering, something's wrong. Whereas this constant feeling of anxiety had just become who I am. For example, like a medical treatment like Xanax or something like that. If you're just able to find out what normal and healthy mental health feels like, that can give you a North Star to navigate to without that medication. You can go, so this is the good version of mental health. I'm not feeling that. So what am I doing? I probably should, go outside, eat well, do things that take care of myself, et cetera, et cetera. I realize I'm not taking care of myself in the right way, et cetera, et cetera. In case you hadn't noticed, I could talk for hours about this.
Yeah. Jody, thank you so much for being here today with us and taking out the time to speak with me today. That was super insightful. And I feel like there's a lot that we can take away from your experience as well. So thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you for saying that. And I had a lot of fun. Take care.
If you enjoyed the episode and would like to help support the show, please follow and subscribe. You can rate and review your feedback on any of our platforms listed in the description. I'd like to recognize our guests who are vulnerable and open to share their life experiences with us. Thank you for showing us we're human. Also, a thank you to our team who worked so hard behind the scenes to make it happen.
Joe Mills,
Chris Trzynski, Stefan Menzel.
The show would be nothing without you. I'm Jenica, host and writer of the show, and you're listening to Multispective.